this one is amazing as well. I'm going to say that about all of these albums because it's Deftones. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I am Molly, and in this video I'm going to be ranking all 9 studio albums from the band Deftones. Now, Deftones is a band that in the last year has quickly become one of my favorite bands of all time. I absolutely love their music. I started out doing a little reaction series to them here on my channel, and it took me no time at all really to just become a huge Deftones fan. Frankly, I've been putting off doing this video because I just find it incredibly difficult to rank their albums. They're all really fantastic. But I told myself that when I hit 10,000 subscribers here on YouTube, I would do this video and finally get my Deftones album ranking out there for you guys to watch. And we just hit that milestone here on this channel, which is incredible to me. That blows my mind that 10,000 of you are subscribed. But yeah, I am finally going to force myself to rank all of Deftones albums and see which one ends up being my favorite. Alright, so to run you all through my ranking system real fast, A+ are the Deftones albums that just blow my mind. A are the Deftones albums that are still basically perfect. There's nothing wrong with them. They're just not quite on par with the A+ albums. B are going to be the Deftones albums that I think are still extremely good. Again, just not quite perfect, but I really thoroughly enjoy them. C is just going to be for the Deftones albums that kind of fade into the background just a little bit. Maybe they're not quite as memorable. And then D are going to be my personal least favorites. So starting off with Deftones' debut album, their 1995 album Adrenaline. This one is amazing. It brings so much energy to it. It's definitely the Deftones album that is the most nu metal sounding. It kind of goes in that style. There's some kind of hip hop influences for sure on this one. And yeah, it just has this really aggressive, kind of like juvenile adolescence, nothing held back nature to it that I love. They just kind of go all out with this album. They throw everything on it. And I will say that kind of makes it lack some cohesion. It's a little bit messy at points, and the production on this one is not the best, especially compared to Deftones' later albums. I will say though, there are some fantastic tracks on this record. The opening one, Bored, is just awesome. It brings so much energy and power to it, and just Chino's voice when he's screaming out the vocals is awesome. I also love the tracks Root and Birthmark, and 7 Words is another standout. 7 Words is kind of one of those songs on this album that goes in that slightly more hip-hop style at points, but it works. I really, really enjoy it. So my final thoughts on Adrenaline. I love certain tracks off of this album. However, the production value and just kind of the lack of cohesion, like I said, that this album has, it's almost like a demo of sorts. It just kind of needs a little more structure. So for that reason, I think I'm gonna put Adrenaline in C. And before you all come at me and start like yelling at me in the comments here, I'm only putting Adrenaline in C because I know what the rest of Deftones albums are gonna be like. It's extremely close to being in B though, because I love Adrenaline. It's such an awesome little album. Alright, so up next is Deftones' second studio album, Around the Fur. This one they released in 1997, so 2 years after Adrenaline. In 2 years, it blows my mind what Deftones did with their sound. Adrenaline's great, don't get me wrong, but they took all of that energy on Adrenaline, they polished it up, they made it a little bit darker, broodier, dirtier sounding, and they made Around the Fur. And this album is just on a level I can't even describe. This album is perfect. It's kind of nu metal-ish, but there's definitely elements there that make it its own distinct genre. I can't really describe exactly what genre this is. It's just awesome. That's all I know. Right off the bat with the opening track, My Own Summer Shove It, this album just gets things started with so much energy and force. Another standout for sure on this one is Mascara, track 3. That one's a little bit more restrained, but it just has this really dark, kind of simmering energy to it that's amazing. There's so much atmosphere on this album. And the title track, Around the Fur, is another huge standout. That's one of my favorites on this album. Also Be Quiet and Drive, which is one of Deftones' most iconic songs for sure. And one of my favorites on this album is Head Up, actually. That one is incredible. How they change that song toward the end, and there's that really, really drawn in bridge toward the end before they just bring all of that energy again. But honestly, I could just go on and on about Around the Fur. I can't begin to describe how much I love this album. The atmosphere of it, the tone of it, everything about it I think is perfect. And for me, Around the Fur is absolutely an A+. I think it's perfection. Up next we have White Pony. Deftones released this one in 2000. They kind of took the same direction they were going in with Around the Fur, and they made it even more atmospheric and creepy and withdrawn. There's such a sinister tone to White Pony that I love. It's a really chilling album. And this one, I could go through every single track on this album and give a reason as to why it's my favorite. It's so hard for me to pick a favorite song off of this one, but definitely some of the highlights are Digital Bath. Knife Party is mind-blowing. It gives me goosebumps every time I listen to it. It's such a chilling song with all of those shrieks going on and the really fascinating vocalizations they use on that one. And then of course Passenger with Maynard James Keenan of Tool. Him and Chino's vocals together just make for such a haunting atmosphere on that one. Change in the House of Flies, probably Deftones' most popular song, is on this album. One of my favorite Deftones songs for sure. And the closing track on White Pony, Pink Maggot, is another huge standout. Like I said, every track on this album I think is fantastic. So in short, White Pony is yet another Deftones album I could rave about for hours and hours, so I'm just gonna shut up at this point and put White Pony in A+, because that's definitely where it deserves to be. There's something about Around the Fur that I always am really drawn to, so I think I'm going to keep Around the Fur at the #1 position, but White Pony is equally as brilliant. I think those two albums are just absolutely fantastic. Up next is going to be Deftones' self-titled album. This one was released in 2003. There's something kind of almost depressive about the tone of their self-titled album, which makes sense kind of knowing the back history of Deftones as a band, what the members were going through around the time of recording this album. That's definitely palpable on the tone of their self-titled, which I actually really enjoy. It makes it kind of this really dark, brooding album to listen to. If you're in a certain mindset, it really just kind of scratches that itch sometimes for me. With that being said, it's not on the level of Around the Fur or White Pony for me personally, but I do love this album. I really enjoy listening to it. Some of the standout tracks I would say are Needles and Pins. That one is one of the more hard-hitting tracks on this album. It brings a lot of energy to it. And When Girls Telephone Boys, that's definitely another standout for me. And I love track 5, Death Blow. That one is a great example of kind of the weird, like melancholy, depressed tone that this album kind of has. There's just kind of a sadness to it that is really palpable. It just makes for some great listening, like I said, when you're in that mindset. So I'm very comfortable putting Deftones' self-titled album in B. I wouldn't say it's a perfect album, but it's got some amazing tracks on it. I love the tone of this album from beginning to end. I really enjoy listening to it. All right, up next is going to be Deftones' 2006 album Saturday Night Wrist. This one is a weird little album. You might be able to tell in my reaction video to Saturday Night Wrist, I was very unsure of this album when I first heard it. It was definitely the Deftones album I was the most on the fence about whether I liked it or not when I first heard it, but I can say it quickly became one of my favorites. I became addicted to the sound of this album, and there's just something so quirky about it that weirdly works. It kind of carries that same depressive, melancholy tone that their self-titled has. It pulls that same tone into Saturday Night Wrist as well, but they add a little bit of, like I said, quirkiness to it. There's some electronic elements they fuse on this one. There's a lot of experimentation going on with the sound for sure. I think my favorite track on this entire album is Beware. There's this seething nature to Beware that is amazing. How they build this track up. And then of course Cherry Waves is amazing. Hole in the Earth and Xerxes are other standouts for me. And Kim Dracula and the closing track Riviere. Like I said, it definitely took me multiple listens to get to this point, but I can officially say now that Saturday Night Wrist is one of my favorite Deftones albums. Just the tone of it and how experimental they are on this one. It shouldn't work, but I think it does really, really well. So I'm gonna put Saturday Night Wrist in A. I think it's a great album. I don't really ever skip any tracks on it when I listen to it. I think it's just great from start to finish. Up next is Deftones' 2010 album Diamond Eyes. This one is amazing as well. I'm going to say that about all of these albums because it's Deftones. Diamond Eyes is just incredible in the really warm, layered instrumentation on this one. And I think in a way it's Deftones' most hopeful or uplifting sounding album as well, which I really enjoy. I kind of like that tone from them. I love how this album brings that amazing energy, but in a much less abrasive way. A good example of this is You've Seen the Butcher. This track goes so hard, but there's still kind of that really warm tone to it as well. It's just less abrasive. I also love track 6, Prince. That is probably one of my most played Deftones songs, to be honest. It just brings the energy. I love that track. And I think my favorite song on this whole album is track 8, Sex Tape. That one has such a warm tone to it, and it's very melodic for Deftones, but it works so well. I absolutely love Chino's vocals on this one. It has such a smooth, ethereal tone to it. It's such a beautiful track. So, Diamond Eyes by Deftones. Is it a perfect album? Yes. Is it on par with White Pony or Around the Fur? For me personally, no. So for that reason, I'm going to put it in A. I think from a technical standpoint, I would put Diamond Eyes like just slightly ahead of Saturday Night Wrist, but I think those two are pretty interchangeable for me personally. Up next is going to be Deftones' 2012 album No Yokan. This one definitely reminds me of Diamond Eyes a lot. It has a similar tone to it, only they kind of take that warm, enveloping feeling that Diamond Eyes had and they pull it out and throw it into outer space. That's kind of the vibe No Yokan gives off. It's got this really futuristic, modern sound to it. It's very streamlined. The tracks flow amazingly well from one into the next. Right off the bat with the opening track, Swerve City, it just sets a great tone for this whole album. Also, the track Leathers definitely brings some amazing intensity. I also love Poltergeist. That's a huge standout. The track Tempest is one of my favorites. It just has such a smooth, streamlined sound to it. Even though this album goes so hard in some areas of its sound, it just retains this incredible, really smooth sound to it. That's the best way I can describe it. Like, it's never really jarring and abrasive. They just kind of keep things really streamlined, which I love. But this whole album is amazing from start to finish. There is not a single track that is out of place or that I skip when I listen to it. It should be an A+. It absolutely should be an A+ because it's a perfect album. I have no faults for No Yokan. It's just not on par with White Pony or Around the Fur for me personally. So I think I'm gonna put No Yokan at the very, very top of A. It is so close to being in A+ for me, but those two, Around the Fur and White Pony, they blow my mind. And No Yokan, as much as I love it, it's just not quite on that level. Up next is going to be Gore. This is Deftones' 2016 album. I will be honest, this is the one Deftones album that for me is good. It's not great. I do enjoy listening to certain tracks off of Gore for sure, but it's not an album I find myself really returning to very often, which is very rare for Deftones. All of their other albums I find myself just getting really sucked into and addicted to for certain periods of time, and that didn't really happen with Gore. I kind of listened to it once when I did my reaction to it, and I enjoyed it, and there's definitely some tracks on this album I love, but I just didn't find myself returning to it very often. And like I said, that's very out of character for Deftones because their albums are always really memorable and they just put like a really vivid imagery in my head based on their tone. And that didn't happen with Gore, which was kind of disappointing. With that being said though, I think it's a really good album. Heart's Wires is by far my favorite track on Gore. I actually think this is one of Deftones' best tracks. I love it. But the album as a whole, for me, Gore was a little bit lackluster. I just wanted something more from it and I never really got it. So for that reason, I'm going to put Gore in D. Again, this is a Deftones ranking, so a D album is still like a solid 7 out of 10. Like, all of these albums are fantastic, so don't like come at me in the comments or anything. I do really like Gore. It's just my least favorite out of all of Deftones' albums. Alright, and last up is going to be Ohms. This is Deftones' most recent album to date. They released it in 2020. This was also the first Deftones album that I listened to in full back when it came out, and I really loved it. It's got a great tone to it. The production is incredible on this album. It sounds so good. It reminds me in a lot of ways of No Yokan. It's very streamlined, and it has this really big sound to it, almost like they're playing in a huge stadium. There's a lot of echoiness going on. The opening track, Genesis, is amazing. Definitely my favorite track on this album, but I also love This Link is Dead and The Spell of Mathematics. Those are two standouts as well. The whole thing is great though. It's always one of those albums I'll think to myself, oh, I'm going to listen to this track off of Ohms, and then I end up listening to the whole album just because it sounds so good. With that being said though, it's not one of Deftones' albums I find myself going back to all that often, but I do love it. I think it's just made really well. So I think I'm going to put Ohms in B, and I would put it above their self-titled just by a hair, but again, depending on the day you ask me, those two are kind of interchangeable. So that is officially my final Deftones album ranking. In A+, the above perfect albums, just the mind-blowing albums, we have Around the Fur and White Pony. In A, so the perfect albums, we have No Yokan, Diamond Eyes, and Saturday Night Wrist. In B, so the extremely solid albums that I do still really love, they're just not quite perfect, we have Ohms and Deftones. In C, so the albums that I still really enjoy, I just kind of skip certain tracks off of them, we just have Adrenaline. And then in D, which are my least favorites, we just have Gore. Alright, so that is going to do it for my final Deftones album ranking. I hope you all enjoyed watching this video. I enjoyed making it, even though it was incredibly difficult for me to rank Deftones albums. I'm sure you all will have a field day down in the comments yelling at me and telling me your different opinions, which honestly is awesome. It just goes to show how good of a band Deftones is, that any of their albums could be someone's favorite, and I would totally understand why. And thank you all again for helping me get to 10,000 subscribers. That is pretty mind-blowing. I never expected this channel to be that popular amongst people, but I'm glad you all are enjoying these videos. I'm loving making them. But yeah, as usual, thank you all so much for watching. Stay tuned, and I will see you in the next video.